The following video is about R-rated movies and thus contains some R-rated material. It's also brought to you by Skillshare. Sign up at the link in the description for a free trial of a premium membership.
Previously on Patrick H. Willems.
This is Charles. Charles?
I can't take any more of this, man. I'm leaving.
Hey guys!
Chloe is going to be our new cast member.
Can you make that happen?
Is this a joke?
I think something very weird is going on.
So at the beginning, it just seemed like some kind of delusion. Maybe in a moment of crisis, Patrick created a friend for himself, like in that movie, The Beaver, starring Mel Gibson. But I think it runs much deeper. I think that while Patrick was on that tropical vacation, during a dark and stormy night, a coconut fell from a tree and just happened to land on the head of a serial killer. And in that moment, the killer's soul was transferred into the coconut. And Pat was passing by and he saw the coconut in the sand and he thought, let me get some of that sweet coconut milk. And he drank from the coconut, thereby transferring the soul into his own body.
Wait, so does that mean there's a serial killer running around with the soul of a coconut? Like Freaky Friday?
Maybe. No theory is off the table right now. Look, all I know for sure is that Charles is alive and he is evil.
Jake, Charles is just a silly merchandising ploy, like Minions or Jacob Tremblay. I myself have a Charles enamel pin. It's perfect for a lapel or even a backpack. We're just making YouTube videos. You don't have to make it all dark and gritty.
Yeah?
Jake, the next video is happening, and this time, we gotta make it dark and gritty.
For over 80 years, the superhero genre has dominated comic books. And in the 21st century, it's come to dominate film and TV as well. For most of those 80 years, the genre was primarily aimed at younger audiences. The film and TV adaptations usually existed in the PG or PG-13 realm. But in recent years, there's been a shift happening. A trend I find kind of strange. Not surprising, but strange. More and more often, the superhero media made by Hollywood is like this.
Oh, fuck you! Fucking deserve!
Looking at all of this, I can't help but go, what? In the past few years, many of the films and TV shows based on DC superhero comics have been aimed exclusively at adults. There is currently no Justice League cartoon on TV, but there was an R-rated direct-to-video animated Justice League movie released this year. The director's cut of Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice is rated R for sequences of violence. And based on the success of a lot of these, major studios seem eager to make more and to keep catering to audiences hungry for movies where superheroes rip each other's limbs off. So how did this happen? Where is it going? And what does it mean? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Look, I'm not trying to go all Helen Lovejoy here.
Won't somebody please think of the children?
I'm just trying to answer
I'm just trying to answer the big question. Now, I know a lot of people are going to flood into the comments before they watch the whole video and accuse me of being a fake nerd who doesn't know the original comics and claim that I'm trying to impose restrictions and censorship upon storytellers. First of all, I do not think that R-rated superhero stories are inherently bad. Many of them are great. I like Logan a lot. I'm excited as hell for James Gunn's Suicide Squad. Deadpool is... Wait one sec. Fine. It's perfectly fine. So no, I'm not saying these shouldn't exist. And please, I beg you, don't accuse me of not knowing the source material. I've been reading comics weekly since 1999. Here's me as a kid when I exclusively wore clothing with Batman on it. Here is my collection of trades and graphic novels. Not pictured here is my collection of literally thousands of single issues. Here are my copies of Watchmen, and Dark Knight Returns, and Miracle Man. I have a first printing of the infamous issue where you can see Batman's dick. So look, Even if you totally disagree with everything I say here, just don't accuse me of not having done my homework. So now that that's out of the way, let's answer an important question. Who were these characters originally for? If we're going to talk about superheroes, we need to go back to where this all began. The comic books. I can sense the blowback already, the people in the comments saying, actually superhero comics were always made for adults. No. Sorry. That's false. From their debut in the late 1930s and into the 40s and 50s, superhero comic books were produced primarily for an audience of children. Sure, teenagers and adults read them as well. They were very popular with soldiers overseas during World War II, but the writers and artists making them were fully aware that kids were their main audience. As Julius Schwartz, DC editor from the 40s through the mid-80s put it, we were putting out magazines for 8 to 12-year-olds. When Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and Steve Ditko revolutionized comics with the Marvel Universe in the 60s, part of their approach was skewing just a tiny bit older. The comics were still kid-friendly, but they were a little bit more psychologically complex for a target audience of 10 to 14-year-olds. The fact is, people tend to become fans of superheroes as kids. My generation was introduced to the genre mostly through the cartoons about X-Men, Spider-Man, and Batman, plus the 90s Batman movies. On its most basic level, these are stories about good versus evil, full of bright primary colors and larger-than-life characters. No matter how dark and gritty and morally complex they sometimes become, at their heart, these were designed for younger audiences. And you know what? That's okay. Lots of great things were made for younger audiences. Miyazaki movies are gorgeous, emotionally mature pieces of art. I know for a fact that you right there, have cried watching at least one Pixar movie. And lest we forget, old George Lucas himself created Star Wars for kids.
It's a film for 12-year-olds.
Okay now, we need to talk about the children.
Won't somebody please think of the children?
There's an important distinction that I need to make here. There is a difference between something made exclusively for children and something that is appropriate for children. The former is something like Dora the Explorer, or say, DC Superhero Girls. The latter is something like Batman the Animated Series, and that is what we're talking about here. That show is ostensibly a kids' show. It aired on the Fox Kids block of Saturday morning cartoons during the 90s. It spawned an endless line of kids' merchandise. But as we all know, the show was made with such a degree of artistry and intelligence that adults loved it. I would argue that it is the single best version of Batman that exists in any medium. The show's feature film spin-off, Mask of the Phantasm, has significantly greater emotional depth than any of the live-action Batman movies. And to date, none of those live-action Batman movies have a sequence as disturbing as the one in which the Joker tortures and brainwashes Robin in Batman Beyond: Return of the Joker. And this is all in a kids' cartoon. So as we continue this discussion, let's drop the idea that because something is aimed at younger audiences, it means it's any less intelligent than a hyper-gritty R-rated movie. If you're embarrassed to enjoy kids' movies, fine. But that's on you. So starting in the early 70s, a shift started occurring. Gradually, comic books started targeting a slightly older audience who were demanding more realism and more complexity in their stories. And this steadily increased into the 80s and 90s. Why? What was happening here? Well, to find out, I did some digging, cracked some skulls, sent a couple emails until I reached the source. A man who had experienced this all firsthand. I talked to Jerry Conway, co-creator of characters like The Punisher, Jason Todd, and Killer Croc, writer of The Death of Gwen Stacy, and an 8-year run on Justice League.
For many decades, the perception of the audience for superhero comics were boys between the ages of 9 and 13. But starting in, I guess, the 1970s, as my generation came in as creators, we started trying to create stories that were still of interest to us. We wanted things that were going to address the concerns that we had now as older adolescents or young adults. And this persisted through the decades. As we creators grew older and as our audience grew older, the tone of comics and the perception of the audience started to shift away from that original conception of kids in their preteens. I think that the stories that we did and the turns that we made were artistically justified. But from a practical publishing point of view, abandoning an entire market just to follow a dynamically decreasing market seemed to me to be pretty self-destructive. I don't object to the idea of stories aimed at adults, but I believe that those should be the tail and not the dog. They should be the thing that you can go to after you've grown out of the original material, and that material should be timeless and should be aimed at a young readership with a slightly less sophisticated or less demanding, mindset, as a 30-year-old reader might have. There's nothing wrong with addressing a 30-year-old reader, but that should not be the mainstay of your publishing efforts when you're dealing with, let's face it, a fundamentally silly and childish conception of fiction.
Did you just get a notebook delivered?
Pat said he was sending us the script for the video.
It was nice of him to write it all out by hand twice. Is yours really damp?
Yeah. And it has this weird smell.
So what's our assignment this time? More dance montages?
I think he mentioned we're supposed to find ways to make the video gritty.
Gritty? Like the lovable orange monster from Philadelphia?
I literally can't imagine he meant anything else.
So what's up with the rating system? For non-American audiences, the R rating in American film, given by the Motion Picture Association of America, stands for restricted, and means that if a viewer is under the age of 17, they are required to be accompanied by a parent or guardian. Now, the American rating system is famously fucked up. Lady Bird and The King's Speech are rated R, and so are The Passion of the Christ and The Raid 2 and the Hostel films. And look, I know a lot of people see R-rated movies when they're kids. I did too. But also, a lot of parents are strict about that and will not take their kids to see an R-rated film. And Hollywood knows that. So the choice to release a movie with an R rating essentially means that they are deliberately cutting off a potential younger audience. And this is where things get interesting. When we have these major corporations producing movies based on characters originally intended for children, but saying, this is not for them anymore. See, the thing about Hollywood is that it's a reactive entity. It never has any real plan, it just constantly attempts to copy and replicate whatever just made money. After the huge opening weekend of the first Deadpool movie, filmmaker James Gunn wrote, "Over the next few months, you'll see Hollywood misunderstanding the lesson they should be learning from Deadpool. They'll be greenlighting films like Deadpool, but by that they won't mean good and original, but a raunchy superhero film, or it breaks the fourth wall. And it also means more R-rated superhero movies, assuming that's the reason it was successful. And a concern I have, just like Jerry Conway said about the comic book industry, is that by continuing down this path, they'll lose the next young audience that is supposed to find these characters. Harley Quinn started out as a character on a cartoon for kids, But those kids grew up and took the character with them, and now she primarily exists in media for adults, the HBO Max cartoon, and the R-rated movie Birds of Prey. And these things aren't bad. The show is good, and the movie is pretty solid, I think. But it seems like Warner Brothers and DC have abandoned the 10-year-old audience that the character was created for. If you spend much time in nerd circles of the internet, or if you, like I have, tweet about the idea of R-rated superhero movies, you'll encounter an indisputable fact. This is something a lot of fans want. Twitter and Reddit and various forums are full of people begging studios for R-rated movies about Superman or the X-Men. Matt Reeves' upcoming Batman movie doesn't have a rating yet, but a hell of a lot of people are hoping it gets an R. So, why is that? Looking at the various R-rated superhero media that exists, they tend to get that rating for one specific reason. It's not sex or nudity, it's not really profanity, it's definitely not drug use, it's violence. If a superhero movie is rated R, that guarantees that it's because it contains more extreme violence than the genre usually has. And this tends to be for one of two reasons. Reason one, indulgence. While in real life, I flee from any instance of conflict and do not generally condone violence unless it's like punching Nazis, I'll be the first to admit that cinematic violence can be extremely satisfying. I'm only human, and I've cheered at my fair share of headshots and impalements and disembowelings. I'm not trying to start a whole exploration of the psychological catharsis of on-screen violence, but I understand the impulse for more. I remember when I was 14 and how excited I was at the rumors that the extended editions of the Lord of the Rings movies might be rated R for additional violence. They weren't, they remained PG-13. But at the time, I was thrilled that Peter Jackson snuck in a few extra decapitations. And then I got older, and I realized how absurd and pointless an R-rated Lord of the Rings would be, since it's a story that was always intended to be for all ages. And then the extended edition of the third Hobbit movie did get an R rating, which is extra weird because The Hobbit was always more of a children's story than Lord of the Rings, but look, we all know that they made some questionable choices with the Hobbit trilogy. I'm using that anecdote as a way of saying that I understand the desire for amplified violence in these stories. But my question is, what is it really adding? Superhero stories are, in one way or another, power fantasies. The premise is that people gain spectacular, impossible abilities and use those abilities to do what we wish we could. Fly, or save the world, or fight corruption and evil. And most often, these stories are about characters using those abilities to solve problems with violence. And again, to be clear, fictional violence is very often cool and fun. The audience is usually meant to identify with the heroes, so when the violence is amplified in R-rated films, what is it accomplishing other than making these heroes appear more powerful and brutal? In the PG-13 theatrical cut of Batman v Superman, Batman flings a wooden crate at a random goon and we go, wow, Batman really hurt that guy. But the R-rated director's cut adds a smear of blood where the goon's head hits the wall, and we go, wow, I think Batman killed that guy.
He's already dead.
It's making the inherent power fantasy more sadistic. What matters here isn't simply what happens on screen, it's how it's portrayed. The thing about cinema is that the visual language being used tells us how we're supposed to feel about it. So when it comes to portrayals of violence, look at this scene in A Clockwork Orange. It shifts between these dispassionate, static wide shots, coldly observing what is happening, and then the perspective of the victims, with the camera on the floor looking up at the attackers. The violence is disturbing and cruel and unpleasant. And then look at this fight scene from the first episode of the show Titans. In pretty much every shot, Robin is the focus. We're experiencing this from his perspective. The camera moves with Robin, amplifying his movements, making him look more powerful. It zooms in on his attacks, like this guy's face being dragged across broken glass. When he's beating the guy on the ground, we focus on Robin's face and how he's feeling. The whole scene is lit with glossy, moody lighting. Everything looks shiny, it's cool, it's sexy. Is this R-rated material being used to say anything? Or is it just there to indulge our desire to see more hardcore versions of these characters? And then there's reason number 2 for R-rated violence: deconstruction. In the comic book Watchmen, Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons very deliberately chose not to portray any of the action or violence as cool. There are no badass poses or big action splash page shots of a hero punching a bad guy. Any instance of violence is shown bluntly and unspectacularly in panels that are the same size and shape as any other, because the superheroes of this story are not meant to be idolized or glamorized in any way. There is nothing indulgent about it. This is one of the core things Zack Snyder got wrong in his film adaptation. As slavishly faithful as the whole thing is, with each shot perfectly recreating each of the comic's panels, Snyder portrays violence in the exact opposite way that Moore and Gibbons did. It's all badass slow-motion shots, with the heroes striking classic comic book poses. The violence is sexy and stylish and cool. It's reconstructing the superhero myth as quickly as the story attempts to deconstruct it. If the comic is saying, superheroes are actually damaged, fucked up people and fighting crime is a pathetic way to feel a sense of power, the movie is saying, yeah, but also it's awesome. This is the same contradiction Snyder continually falls into. Batman v Superman wants us to question the purpose of superheroes and whether or not they should exist in the world, but it also really loves it when Batman stabs people and blows them up in slow motion. This is what makes the Amazon TV series The Boys so effective. It uses similar aesthetics and visual language as Snyder's films, but tells the story from the perspective of regular humans. From this perspective, the superheroes using their powers to kill and maim isn't cool, it's terrifying. The trope of Superman's glowing red eyes is no longer shorthand for badass rage. It's now a symbol of sociopathic violence, as we see it rip through innocent civilians or melt people's skulls. But really, the ultimate example of the R-rated superhero deconstruction is the one that everything else has been ripping off for the past 35 years. Alan Moore's Miracle Man, which was originally called Marvel Man until Marvel Comics got lawyers involved. It's a reboot of a comic from the 1950s that's really just a ripoff of Shazam, about a kid who turns into a superhero when he says a magic word. But Moore's story takes place decades later, when the kid has grown up and longs for the fun and adventure these stories used to have. He's a stand-in for the adult comic book reader, who loved superhero comics as a kid and never moved past them. So in the story, when Michael Moran remembers his magic word and can fly again, it starts off as a glorious thrill, until the real world seeps in, until the gross, cynical truth behind those innocent early adventures is revealed, and Miracle Man encounters his former sidekick, whose godlike powers have turned him into a monstrous psychopath. The series culminates in a massive superhero battle that is not fun at all. It's a genocidal nightmare. It's like Moore is saying, okay, you want superheroes for adults? Well, it's not gonna be cool or indulgent. It's going to be awful and disturbing. And in the end, the story points to a new way forward. It moves beyond the classic superhero tropes and conflicts as Miracle Man remakes the entire world, abolishing all weapons and money. It's showing us that superhero stories for adults can be full of challenging new ideas, not just amped up, gritty, violent versions of what we've seen before.
Oh, check out this one. Gritty's wearing a suit.
He's classy, but he still knows how to party.
So is this what you do for every video?
No, it kind of varies. Sometimes I just sit there and listen. Sometimes I operate the camera. I was in the band for the talk show.
Oh yeah, I did that too. It's weird that Patrick doesn't seem to remember.
I think he just took it hard when you didn't come back. There were a lot of disappointments around that time.
Uh-huh. So, what's our job title, anyway?
You know, I never actually asked. Maybe I should... Oh my god, look at this! It's Gritty dressed as Rocky.
Hell yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
This notebook smells good. I kind of like it now.
There's a quote from Roger Langridge, who wrote the great all-ages comic Thor the Mighty Avenger, that I think about a lot. He said, "I really don't think Marvel and DC are helping things by having gritty, R-rated versions of their superheroes in their main comics, what they sell as the real versions, while simultaneously selling those exact same characters in kids' comics and plastering them all over lunchboxes and animated cartoons. Casual readership by kids or by parents for their kids is effectively impossible the way things are currently structured, and I think the waters are muddied too far now to claw that ground back. I think it's insane that DC have spent 70 years making Superman as big as Mickey Mouse and branding him to be understood by parents as being pretty much as kid-friendly as Mickey Mouse, only to piss that brand away in a decade. Nothing wrong with doing mature content in comics. In fact, it should be encouraged as often as possible. But doing it with characters who are on your kids' lunchboxes is kind of moronic. Take a lesson from Watchmen and come up with new characters for that stuff. And then go back to Superman and Batman and put the same kind of love and effort and craft and intelligence you've been putting into all those rape scenes and body mutilations into something kids can read, and adults can also be proud to read because of all the love and effort and craft and intelligence you've put into it, and make those the real versions. I think this sums it all up pretty perfectly. This is why I have absolutely no problem with things like Watchmen Are the Boys, because those characters only exist in those stories. They were created exclusively for adults, and there's no kids version happening simultaneously. And even something like The Dark Knight Returns, sure, it's about Batman, but it's an out-of-continuity miniseries. It's not the main ongoing Batman comic. It's an alternate version of the character made for an older audience, which is why it's kind of weird that that's the version that Zack Snyder based his main canonical Batman movie on. Anyway, when Alan Moore wrote Superman comics, they weren't full of murder and brutal violence. They were very much in the mold of classic Superman stories for the classic Superman audience. Now, the other Alan Moore comic we must bring up is The Killing Joke, the famous Batman story in which the Joker shoots Barbara Gordon through the spine, strips her clothes off, and photographs her naked, writhing in pain, and uses these photos to torment her father, who is bound and gagged in bondage gear. It's, pretty grim. Definitely grimmer than a regular Batman story, and so for decades, it has been held up by fans as one of the best ever stories about these characters. But Alan Moore himself called it a regrettable misstep on my part. He said, "I've been told the Joker film wouldn't exist without my Joker story, but 3 months after I'd written that, I was disowning it. It was far too violent. It was Batman, for Christ's sake. It's a guy dressed as a bat. Increasingly, I think the best version of Batman was Adam West, which didn't take it at all seriously." Whoa, Alan, go off. So tell us what you think about superheroes in general. I have no interest in superheroes. They were a thing that was invented in the late 1930s for children, and they are perfectly good as children's entertainment. But if you try to make them for the adult world, then I think it becomes kind of grotesque. Okay, maybe a little more extreme than I would go, but yeah, I get it.
Won't somebody please think of the children?
Now, I love superhero comics and superhero movies, and I love that this genre has become so embraced by mainstream audiences. But we can't forget that at their core, superheroes are inherently kind of silly. These are stories about people who gain magical powers in freak accidents and decide to dress in tight, colorful costumes, give themselves made-up nicknames, and spend their time punching criminals in the face. No matter how serious and mythic and profound and gritty these stories can be, there is always going to be that silliness at the heart of it.
There's nothing wrong with silly. People forget that when Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko were creating Marvel and making such a huge impact on comics with doing, quote, adult stories. If you actually read those stories, they are not adult stories. They are silly. And the college students who embraced that material were embracing it, at least in part, because it gave them the freedom to be silly, to embrace the silliness of these characters. By the eye winking and the acknowledgement that it was silly that came with Stan's commentary. But we do get, as you say, self-conscious over time, and we start looking for excuses for why it's really good stuff. Well, it's really good stuff on its own terms.
So when you have Robin, this guy, saying, "Fuck Batman.
Fuck Batman."
And stabbing people in the dick with garden shears while also wearing a colorful spandex costume, it creates this dissonance. It's trying very hard to be serious and adult, but it's like a 13-year-old's idea of what adult means. It's so clearly embarrassed about what it is. It's so afraid of being silly or childish that it ends up even more ridiculous. It's like watching a person try to unironically sing a Nickelback song.
Look at this photograph. Every time I do it makes me laugh.
Look, I know comic books were dismissed for decades as dumb, childish stuff, and I remember when I was younger and I desperately wanted them to be taken seriously. But this desperation is how you end up with comics like Identity Crisis, DC's crossover event. Most of the story revolves around the reveal that years earlier, C-list supervillain Dr. Light sexually assaulted Elongated Man's wife, and then the Justice League covered it up. The entire thing is an agonizing attempt to cram quote-unquote adult themes into inherently childish material, and the end result is just unpleasant. But I'll admit, when I was 16, I thought it was awesome. The R-rated versions that work know how to navigate this. Deadpool leans into the silliness and absurdity and positions itself as a wacky, anarchic side story within a classic superhero universe. And Logan, which is as gritty and serious as they come, makes that work by stripping away all the tropes and iconography of superheroes and shifting into an entirely different genre altogether. If you haven't heard, it's secretly a Western. So here's the part I know is coming, where people in the comments accuse me of being a hypocrite. In other videos, I'm advocating for filmmakers to have creative freedom, or I'm demanding that big franchise entertainment take more risks and move away from predictable homogeneity. So why now am I imposing these restrictions on these characters and saying they have to be done a certain way? Well, that's not really what I'm saying. What I'm saying here is really less about the creators of these movies and shows, and more about the audience. We don't own these characters, and there's something kind of selfish about demanding that they change to appeal to us as we get older. It's depriving younger generations of discovering them the way we did, claiming ownership over fiction that existed long before us and will, theoretically, outlive us all. It's like if kids who grew up watching DuckTales demanded that the recent reboot be catered specifically to them as adults, with Scrooge McDuck, like, snorting coke off of prostitutes, or if the South Park version of Mickey Mouse was now the canonical modern Disney version. If you want to see a violent, challenging movie made for adults, don't demand an R-rated Batman movie. Go watch something like Lynn Ramsey's You Were Never Really Here. It's kind of like Joker, and it also has Joaquin Phoenix, but it is much, much better than Joker. Look, I have detailed my many issues and frustrations with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but a key thing that those movies get right is that they understand who their core audience is. It's the same thing as Star Wars or Doctor Who or Harry Potter. They take it seriously, they make it appealing to all audiences, but they never lose sight of the fact that from the start, these have been adventure stories for kids. So let's go back to Alan Moore. It always comes back to Alan Moore. And the very last panel and very last line of Watchmen. I leave it entirely in your hands. It's a message to the reader, as well as to other comic book creators. Over those 12 issues, Moore and Dave Gibbons had demonstrated what could be possible in comic books and the superhero genre. They showed how they could be more challenging and experimental than we were used to. And here, at the end, is an almost fourth wall breaking message to carry this forward, to keep innovating and evolving. And instead, the only message people seem to take from it is that it's cool when superheroes are dark and violent. Instead of creating new stories and characters that went in new directions, they just made Batman comics grimmer. As Moore himself said, it was meant to be something that would liberate comics. Instead, it became this massive stumbling block that comics can't even really seem to get around to this day. They've lost a lot of their original innocence, and they can't get that back. And they're stuck, it seems, in this kind of depressive ghetto of grimness and psychosis. I'm not too proud of being the author of that regrettable trend. And that's still happening right now. This demand for R-rated superhero movies is a result of the same thing that causes all these dudes to throw fits online anytime DC or Marvel dares to publish a comic for middle school girls, or like a Wonder Woman variant cover by Robin Eisenberg. They refuse to accept that sometimes something just isn't made for them. Look, I'm a 33-year-old straight white male who likes nerdy shit. Pretty much the majority of media these days, especially comic books and comic book adaptations, is aimed directly at me. And that's nice, but look, I don't need it all. I want new generations to come in and discover this stuff the same way I did. And who the fuck are we kidding? The stuff made for kids, like Batman the Animated Series, it totally rules. So why would anyone act like that's a bad thing? More of that, please. Okay, so I watched the video.
And? Pretty gritty, huh?
Did you guys actually read the script?
Mine smelled bad.
So look, this isn't what I had in mind, but I've gotta say, it's not bad. I mean, I guess I'm just a sucker for googly eyes. Like, look at those things. So I think one thing that's really clear in this whole discussion is that just putting a lot of edgy adult content in a story does not make it good. Whether it's for a mature audience or for all ages, the fundamental story that you're telling has to be engaging and exciting. So if you want to get better at that, you should check out the class Writing Suspense: How to Write Stories That Thrill in Any Genre on Skillshare. It's taught by Benjamin Percy, who is currently writing X-Force and Wolverine for Marvel, two series that I gotta say I am really enjoying right now. That class is available on Skillshare along with thousands of others, not just about writing, but about filmmaking and music and cooking, and look, the list, it goes on. I was actually just watching Polymatter's class on how to make an animated YouTube video. And right now, the first 1,000 people that sign up at the link in the description right down there will get a free trial of a Skillshare Premium membership. So if you've got some free time coming up over the holidays, you should sign up now, improve your writing skills, and then write great comic books so that I can read them. Please, do it for me.